Hello, this is a look at the significant moments in chapter 1 of Jekyll and Hyde. It's to sort of look at the text in the way that we would go through it if we were reading it together in class. Obviously, I'm not going to read the text out to you. You can read it yourself, you can find some amazing audio recordings online, but this is the sort of stuff that I would pick out and talk to you about if we were reading the novel in class. So just so we're all literally as well as figuratively on the same page, I am using the Signet Classics version of Jekyll and Hyde that looks like this one. So let's start at page 47, which is chapter 1. The things that I would talk about first would be the fact that this is a Gothic text. So if we're thinking about it within those parameters, it has a story within a story. There's a sense of mystery immediately created with the fact that the chapter is called Story of the Door. If you're thinking about a door, it's a way into something literally, but figuratively, it's a way into the story. It's already bringing up those ideas of what is hidden behind doors, what goes on behind closed doors, what do we actually know about people. And when you're reading the novel, I know it's really hard not to be cynical about it, but try and read it with fresh eyes as though you haven't heard the idea of someone being Jekyll and Hyde a million times. You've got to start thinking about the story with that initial idea that it is a mystery. It's a Gothic mystery, and everything that we look at to start with is sort of loaded in this idea of things being hidden. So we need to approach the novel in that way. Also be thinking about AO3. You're thinking about context, and mentioning that it's in the tradition of the Gothic is definitely a high level point that you can make with AO3. So let's get started. Oh, I'm so sorry. Let's go back to that page. If we're looking at the very first paragraph, we are introduced to Mr. Utterson, and we know that he is a lawyer. So here we are seeing him as a rational individual, somebody who is methodical, not over emotional, but who balances up the evidence of things he sees and comes to rational conclusions. We've got these descriptions of him: cold, scanty, and embarrassed, this triadic structure where everything feels rhythmic and it flows on from each other. So we get this sense that Mr. Utterson is someone that we're not expecting something too unexpected from. He is predictable, he is calm, and yet we have the oxymoron of this, that he is yet somehow lovable. So we've got these adjectives and these descriptions that he is not emotional, he's quite a cold person, he doesn't talk a lot, which is what it would be embarrassed in discourse. He's long, dusty and dreary, and yet we have this oxymoron that he is lovable. So we're getting this insight into his character. Though the adjectives seem one thing, yet he is another, which I think plays into the whole theme of the novel. If we move down the page a little bit more to where drank gin when he was alone to mortify a taste for vintages, we can see that although he is upper class, he is high class, that he wants to drink vintage wines, he goes for the lower class option of drinking gin, and it's already seeding ideas to us that social class is something that will permeate the novel, the assumptions that we make about someone from knowing their social class. If we move down to in this character, it was frequently his fortune to be the last reputable acquaintance. This shows a moment of foreshadowing that when something is going terribly wrong with a person, Mr. Utterson is still someone who does not abandon them, even though the rest of their friends have, and also never marked a shade of change in his demeanour. We see him as a non-judgmental individual, which is really, really important. Let's turn over the page to page 48. The first thing highlighted is friends were those of his own blood or those whom he'd known the longest. So we are getting the sensation in the novel already that he is not somebody who just picks up casual acquaintances. His friendships and relationships are of long standing, suggesting a man who is trustworthy, who is not likely to just abandon people. So we are seeing this in a positive light to his character. Then we get the introduction of Mr. Richard Enfield, who is a distant relative, which we know from his distant kinsman. He is a very different sort of man. He is well known about town. And then we get this next bit highlighted about their Sunday walks. So it looks like they are not enjoying their Sunday walk. It's singularly dull, and they would have the obvious relief at the appearance of a friend. So almost they look like they want to be interrupted, that they don't want this two-person friendship as they are walking around. However, this walk is the chief jewel of each week for these men. So we actually get the sense of value that they take in each other. And again, it hints that appearances can be deceptive. You see one thing, it looks like two men who aren't very comfortable together. In fact, it is something that they massively enjoy. So again, Stevenson is already hinting that appearances are not necessarily everything they seem. If we move on down the page where I have highlighted "it seemed," I think that's really important because the whole novel is about what it seems, not necessarily what it is. And Stevenson is establishing that here very nice and early in chapter 1. So we see one thing in the street, but however, it might be something else. And that is hinted that we get like rows of smiling saleswomen, that things are about a transaction, that you might be smiling, but you're actually doing it for a reason. There is a sense of duplicity here, that it seems to be one thing, but it is in fact something else. It's a verisimilitude of friendliness rather than the actual thing. If we go down to the next highlighted bit, the street shone out in contrast to its dingy neighbourhood. So again, we've got that idea of a duality. One thing next to another. We've got the beautiful neighbourhood that seems friendly and welcoming and affluent, and right next to it we have the contrast, the dingy, run-down neighbourhood. And this novel is all about opposites and duality and contrasts, things being next to each other and being next to something that is opposite. Let's turn over the page now, and we would be on page 49. And we start describing this slightly less salubrious building. It is looking run down, it is broken, and we have this idea of a certain sinister block of building. So we've got this foreshadowing that this, in the Gothic tradition, is a place where mysterious, unsettling, and terrible things might be happening. Interesting use of the verb thrust, which is a very strong verb. It's not particularly friendly. So again, it applies to those connotations of how we feel about the building. Interesting use of personification or anthropomorphism, with the blind forehead and every feature of the wall. And again, that gives that sense of mystery by seeing the building like a face. Like, what is behind it? Where is the mystery? If we look as well at the idea that there's sordid negligence. So we are being asked by the word sordid to make a moral judgment. If we see things that are run down and decayed, we are likely to see not just that they are physically like that, but there's moral decay in them. So bad things are likely to happen in poor areas. We should be distrustful. We make that association that it's blistered and disdained, that these things are not nice to look at, they are not nice to touch, and we associate them with the evil side of mankind's character. If we scooch down the page a little bit, and we've got Mr. Enfield starting to tell Mr. Utterson the story, and this is a very Gothic construct. So if we're talking about what the author is doing here, Stevenson is having a story within a story. We've got Mr. Utterson and Mr. Enfield going for a walk, but within that story, Mr. Enfield is telling the story of what's happened to him previously and the association with this door and this horrible building. Very Gothic. Remember this for your AO3. If we start looking at the story Mr. Enfield is telling, we've got the black winter morning, a brilliant piece of pathetic fallacy. We know this tale is going to be dark and fit in with the Gothic tradition. Let's turn over the page. So we are now on page 50. And we've got this horrible story of the man trampling calmly over the child's body. So you've got the verb trampled and the adverb that he is doing it calmly. Think of your AO2. And there's something horribly inhuman about the idea that you could squash a child and feel no emotion behind it. If we want to see this in terms of AO3, we can link it to how people were feeling perhaps in the 19th century. So we can have a parallel with how progress was being driven forwards in the 19th century, and Stevenson recognising that within that sort of push forwards of industrialisation, urbanisation, innocent people sort of get trampled and left behind by what is happening. Great point to make for your AO3. Then we're going to look at the idea that he is described as some damned juggernaut. Brilliant quotation to remember when you are writing about Hyde. So I've just underlined it for you there. I'm just making another little point about social class in that Mr. Enfield says view halua, which is something from hunting. So if you think that's showing his social class as very high class, he is upper class. And the social mores, spelled M-O-R-E-S of the time, would suggest that someone who is involved in that sort of vocabulary is going to be educated and have quite a lot of money. So we see his background, then we have his description. And then we get this visceral reaction that the man brings out in Enfield, that he's so ugly that it brought out the sweat on me like running. There's an instinctive hatred of this man, that there is something about him that makes everyone just hate him, that he takes a loathing to my gentleman at first sight. And it's not just Enfield. Sawbones is a sort of slang term for a doctor, and I've highlighted here as well that the sawbone turns sick and white with the desire to kill him. There is something intrinsically evil about this man that people's instinctive, visceral reaction is to hate him and want to cause him harm. We're going to turn the page now to page 51. And here there's a description of the man with a kind of black, sneering coolness, really like Satan. So everything within him, the colour imagery, is just bound up with this biblical image of absolute evil. If we move down a little further to that place with the door, we've got this link to the door. What is behind a facade? So you see something and you don't know what the interior is, suggesting through Stevenson that you could see the exterior of a person but not know what is going on with their inside, their thoughts, their emotions, their feelings. So this idea of the door is hugely significant. So don't just see it as literally a door, see it as symbolic of how Stevenson is viewing mankind. We've got the intriguing Gothic detail of a name that I can't mention. And that is to draw in the reader and wonder what the mystery about this person is. If we carry on a little further, we know that the person is the very pink of the proprieties, celebrated too. So it is not somebody that we would suspect would be caught up in wrongdoing, bad behaviour, and sort of lower class individual that this trampling man suggests. We've also got a little hint again at AO3 that he's an honest man paying through the nose for some of the capers of his youth, that because the man that Mr. Enfield assumes is being blackmailed by the juggernaut trampling man, there is this idea that perhaps if someone is upper class, they might make a mistake, it's something to do with their youth, they wouldn't be unduly punished for it. Whereas perhaps if someone is working class or lower class, that we would expect there to be long-term prospects. If we move on to the fact he refers to it as black male house, we've got the colour association with the darkness of the black. We've got the blackmail. This is his assumption that the only reason this lower class repulsive man could be anyway associated with the man who is celebrated and the very pink of proprieties is because of blackmail. There's no good reason that someone of one class would be in the power or associated with someone of a lower class. As we move down the page a little further, we've got the more it looks like Queer Street, the less I ask. So this idea again of the social mores, that if something doesn't look right, it would be the gentlemanly thing is not to inquire of the person. So just because they know of this person who they assume is being blackmailed, it is not the gentlemanly thing to do to inquire. And I think as the novel progresses and we think about how Stevenson is portraying the characters and their very real curiosity that gets roused, we have to understand why they don't ask questions. And much further down on the page, the windows are always shut. So again, this sense of secrecy, the interior is unknowable, and there's nothing that we can do to penetrate that secrecy because, like the windows, it is shut. If we look at the next page, page 53, we've got it's hard to say where one ends and another begins, and that is a great allusion, another AO3, to the moral degradation of London. If you think about how millions of people suddenly poured into London, they were living in unsanitary conditions, there was moral degradation, they weren't living sort of clean, moral lives. And there's this suspicion in the novel almost of London as a character polluting individuals. We go down a little bit further. We've got the name of Hyde. Obviously it's spelled with a Y, but the association we're making is that someone is hiding something. One of the huge themes of the novel, what is being hidden. I've also highlighted this about there is something wrong with his appearance, something displeasing, something downright detestable. There is this idea that there is something morally repulsive about Hyde. No one can quite put their finger on it. It's part of the whole mystery, but again, something wrong with his appearance, something displeasing is very easy to remember for when you're revising for your exams and you want to talk about the character of Hyde and people's immediate reactions. It's a really nice one to remember. And then finally, the last page of this chapter, page 54. So I just wanted to talk very quickly the themes we would have appearing in this chapter. We would have appearances, what they tell us. We've got the idea of doors and streets hiding things from us. We've got the appearance of the man. Can we know someone from just what they look like? Do we just know them from how they behave? Motifs, which are ideas that appear regularly throughout the novel. We've got the dark side of London, the physical threat of the unknown in there. AO3, lots of ideas about class and social mores, and these are all going to be incredibly important through the rest of the novel. What would probably be most useful is if you read the novel, read this first chapter, taking into account the notes I've given you. Stop the video at each point where you feel you need to add something to your copy. And then also I have got a summary of what happens in the novel, which will accompany this. But this bit is so simple. Mr. Utterson, the lawyer, is introduced. He goes for a walk with his kinsman, Mr. Enfield. He tells him about this very strange story where he saw, associated with the door, a man that everybody instinctively loathed, just trample an innocent child, pay off the family as a sort of redemption. And the name on the cheque was not Mr. Hyde, which is the trampling man's name, but the name of a very well known, respectable man that both Mr. Utterson and Mr. Enfield know. And that is the end of chapter 1. Thank you.